A 22-year-old intern just destroyed a Fortune 500 CEO in front of his entire board using a sales technique from 1937. The CEO had no idea what hit him. But here's what's really shocking. This same technique could expose every lie your boss tells you tomorrow. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, and honestly, I should have known something was up when the CEO himself dialed my number. Big shots don't usually call middle managers directly unless they want something specific. His voice had that smooth confidence that successful people develop over decades of closing deals and winning arguments. "I've got an opportunity that's going to change everything for our division," he started, jumping straight into numbers that sounded almost too perfect. Revenue projections that doubled our current performance, market expansion into territories we'd never touched, partnership deals with companies I'd only dreamed of working with. The language he used made my head spin a little. Synergistic value propositions, leveraged growth matrices, multi-tiered optimization strategies. These weren't terms you'd hear in normal business conversations, but they sounded impressive enough that questioning them felt almost embarrassing. Like admitting you don't understand quantum physics at a dinner party. What struck me as odd was how quickly he wanted everything signed. "We need to move fast on this," he kept saying. "The window won't stay open forever." When I asked for time to review the contract details, he brushed it off with a laugh. "Trust me, you don't want to overthink this one. Sometimes the best opportunities require a leap of faith." Then there's the secrecy angle. He made it very clear that this conversation should stay between us for now. "The board doesn't need to know every detail until we're ready to announce," he explained. "Too many cooks in the kitchen, you know? But here's what bothered me. In 15 years of working for this company, every major deal had involved multiple departments and plenty of review time. The contract itself arrived the next day, and flipping through it felt like reading a foreign language. Dense paragraphs filled with legal terminology that seemed designed to confuse rather than clarify. Most of my colleagues would probably skim through it, trust the CEO's summary, and sign on the dotted line. After all, he'd built this company from nothing into a major player in our industry. But something nagged at me as I compared his current promises to things he'd said in previous meetings. 6 months ago, he'd told our team that expansion into new markets was at least 2 years away because we lacked the infrastructure. Now, suddenly we were ready to double our reach overnight. The math didn't add up, and the timeline felt impossibly compressed. During our follow-up meeting, I watched how he presented the deal to other department heads. Same smooth delivery, same impressive terminology, same urgent timeline. Everyone nodded along, asked a few surface-level questions, and seemed ready to move forward. The pressure in the room was subtle but real, like being the only person at a concert who doesn't know when to clap. One detail kept bothering me more than the others. The CEO claimed our main competitor had tried to secure this same partnership deal but lost out because they lacked our innovative approach. When I'd spoken to contacts at that competitor company just weeks earlier, they'd mentioned focusing entirely on domestic growth this year. Why would they be chasing international partnerships if that was their strategy? And the weird part is, every time I brought up a specific concern, his answers became more general. Ask about timeline details, get a response about market opportunities, ask about financial projections, hear about industry trends. It was like trying to nail down Mercury. The more precisely I pressed, the more the conversation slipped away from concrete facts. My gut started sending stronger signals during our third meeting. The CEO's confidence never wavered, but his explanations began repeating the same key phrases: revolutionary approach, first mover advantage, unprecedented opportunity. Politicians do this when they want to sound substantive without actually saying anything specific. The other thing that struck me was how he handled interruptions. When his assistant knocked to remind him about another appointment, he snapped at her in a way that seemed out of character. When someone's phone buzzed during his presentation, his jaw tightened for just a moment before he resumed that practiced smile. These weren't the reactions of someone who felt completely confident in their position. Looking back, all these red flags were pointing toward one conclusion, but I wasn't ready to accept it yet. This was our CEO, after all, the man who guided the company through 3 major industry shifts and always come out ahead. Questioning his judgment felt like questioning gravity. Possible in theory, but who wants to be the person testing it? Still, something my grandfather taught me years ago kept echoing in my mind. He dealt with plenty of smooth talkers during his career, and he developed some interesting methods for separating truth from salesmanship. Methods that might work just as well in a corporate boardroom as they did on a sales floor decades ago. The CEO's presentation deck that Tuesday morning looked like a masterpiece. Every chart climbed upward. Every projection showed growth. Revenue numbers that made my eyes widen sat right there in glossy perfection. But something felt wrong about those beautiful graphs, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had polished them a little too much. His voice never paused. Not once. When you sat through enough business meetings, you notice patterns. Good leaders leave space for questions. They breathe between big statements. They let important numbers sink in. This guy? He talked like a machine gun firing statistics. Quarter-over-quarter growth, market penetration rates, projected returns, all delivered at breakneck speed without a single any questions thrown in. The weird part is how he handled eye contact. Professional speakers usually scan the room, connecting with different faces. Our CEO locked onto the back wall like it held the secrets of the universe. When someone shifted in their chair or leaned forward, he'd speed up even more. Classic deflection behavior, though most people in that room probably thought he was just passionate about the numbers. Then there was the pressure. You know that feeling when someone really, really wants you to say yes right now? It hung in the air like thick cologne. Every few minutes he mentioned timing. This window won't stay open long. Market conditions are perfect right now. We need to move fast before competitors catch on. The urgency felt manufactured, like those late-night TV commercials promising deals that expire in the next 20 minutes. Let's not forget the redirect game he played whenever someone tried to dig deeper. Sarah from accounting raised her hand about cash flow projections. He pivoted to market share. Mike from operations asked about implementation costs. Suddenly we were discussing brand positioning instead. Each dodge happened so smoothly that most people probably didn't notice they never got actual answers to their actual questions. But here's what really caught my attention, the missing details that should have been there. So when executives pitch legitimate deals, they usually mention risks, they acknowledge challenges, they explain what could go wrong and how they plan to handle it. Our golden boy presented everything like a guaranteed home run. No obstacles, no contingencies, no backup plans, just pure, unfiltered success waiting for our signatures. My grandfather used to say that honest salesmen always include the bad news with the good news. Dishonest ones paint everything in sunshine and rainbows. Well, this presentation was brighter than a Florida beach in July. And the weird part is how everyone else seemed hypnotized by the show. Heads nodded at all the right moments. People scribbled notes like they were capturing wisdom from a business prophet. The room had that electric feeling you get when a group decides something is amazing without really thinking about why. Group psychology at its finest, or most dangerous. During the coffee break, I tested the waters with a few colleagues. Those growth numbers seem aggressive, I mentioned to Janet. She shrugged and said the CEO must know something we don't. When I asked Tom about the timeline feeling rushed, he pointed out that opportunities don't wait around. Fair points, maybe. But their certainty felt borrowed rather than earned. The second half of the meeting brought more of the same rapid-fire delivery. More charts pointing skyward, more deadline pressure wrapped in opportunity language, but now I was watching his body language instead of just listening to his words. Fidgeting hands, quick glances toward the door. The subtle signs of someone who wants to finish this conversation and escape before questions start flying. Then, there was the assistant situation. Every time the CEO made a particularly bold claim, his right-hand woman would look down at her papers, not checking facts or nodding in agreement, just avoiding eye contact entirely. When your own team won't look at you during the big promises, that tells a story worth hearing. Professional instinct kicked in around that point. Years of watching people pitch ideas teaches you to separate confidence from competence. Confidence can fool a room full of smart people. Competence leaves traces you can verify later. This presentation had plenty of the first thing and suspicious gaps where the second thing should have been living. By the time he wrapped up with another reminder about acting quickly, my gut was sending alarm signals. Not panic exactly, more like that nagging feeling you get when something important is hiding just outside your view. The kind of feeling my grandfather taught me never to ignore, especially when money and careers hang in the balance. The room erupted in polite applause as he gathered his materials. but I sat there thinking about old lessons learned in much tougher times, wondering if wisdom from the Great Depression might just save us from a very modern mistake. My grandfather sold men's suits during the Great Depression. Not exactly glamorous work, but it taught him things about people that most folks never learn. He'd stand behind that counter, watching desperate men try to look confident while their wallets grew thinner by the day. Everyone was selling something back then. Everyone was also lying about something. He used to tell me stories while we sat on his porch, drinking sweet tea that was more sugar than sense. "Billy," he'd say, squinting at the horizon like he could still see those old customers walking through his door. "The fancier a man talks, the emptier his promises usually are." The Depression made people creative with the truth. It also made my grandfather very good at spotting those creative types. Well, here's the thing about selling suits in the 1930s. You couldn't just throw around big words and hope people bought your story. Money was scarce. Real scarce. If someone walked into that shop, they needed to trust you completely or they walk right back out. My grandfather learned to read people like newspapers. Their body language, their word choices, even the way they handled fabric told him everything he needed to know. But the really interesting part came when other salesmen tried to fool him. See, my grandfather wasn't just selling suits, he was also buying them from suppliers, dealing with traveling salesmen who promised him the world for the right price. These guys had tricks that would make a magician jealous. They'd create urgency where none existed. They'd throw around numbers that sounded impressive but meant nothing. They'd make promises about quality that disappeared the moment you signed their contracts. My grandfather developed his own defense system. Simple questions asked at exactly the right moment. Nothing fancy, nothing aggressive, just direct questions that cut through all the smooth talk like a hot knife through butter. "What exactly does that cost?" he'd ask, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Makes sense, right? If someone's telling the truth, they don't mind repeating it publicly. Then there was his favorite technique, something he called the public price check. When a traveling salesman quoted him a price, my grandfather would repeat it back loudly, making sure everyone nearby could hear. "So you're saying $50 for this batch of wool suits?" The honest salesman never flinched. The dishonest ones, they'd start backtracking faster than a cat in a dog park. And the weird part is how well this worked. Liars hate public attention on their specific claims. They love vague conversations where details can shift and change. But the moment you pin them down with exact numbers, exact promises, exact timelines, well, that's when things get interesting. My grandfather watched dozens of smooth-talking salesmen stumble over their own stories once he started asking for specifics out loud. He also taught me about the scarcity trick. "This is the last shipment we'll have for months," they'd claim. Or, "I can only offer this price today." Sound familiar? My grandfather would simply ask, "Why?" Not in a challenging way, just curious, and "Why is this the last shipment? Why can this price only last today?" Honest answers came quickly and made sense. Dishonest ones, they got complicated fast. Let's not forget the confidence game itself. My grandfather saw plenty of salesmen who could charm birds out of trees. They had perfect posture, perfect smiles, perfect everything. But confidence, he learned, was just performance. Anyone can act confident for 30 minutes. The question was whether their facts could survive 30 minutes of gentle questioning. "Confidence can be faked," he told me more times than I can count. Facts cannot. That phrase stuck with me through college, through my early career, through every business deal I'd ever encounter. It became my personal lie detector, though I didn't realize how much I'd need it until that CEO started talking about his amazing opportunity. My grandfather's stories weren't just entertainment, they were training. He was teaching me to recognize the same patterns he'd seen decades earlier, the same tricks that worked in 1935 and somehow still work today. Human nature doesn't change much, apparently. Neither do the methods people use to hide inconvenient truths. The timing of his lessons couldn't have been better. Because sitting in that conference room, listening to our CEO's polished presentation, I could practically hear my grandfather's voice. The fancy language, the rushed timeline, the vague promises. It was like watching one of those 1930s traveling salesmen, just with better clothes and a PowerPoint presentation. But here's what my grandfather probably didn't anticipate: how those old school techniques could be turned around and used as weapons against modern day smooth talkers. The same questions that exposed dishonest suit suppliers could work on dishonest CEOs. The same public pressure that made traveling salesmen nervous could make corporate executives squirm. Time to put his lessons to work. The moment had arrived. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head like a broken record. Ask the hard question when everyone can hear it. Simple advice, but putting it into practice, that felt like stepping into a boxing ring with a heavyweight champion. The next meeting rolled around faster than I expected. Conference room 12, same polished table, same motivational posters, nobody actually read. The CEO strutted in wearing his usual confident smile and that expensive suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. His assistant trailed behind, clutching a stack of papers like they contained the secrets to eternal wealth. 23 people packed into that room. I counted them twice. Each person represented another witness to whatever was about to unfold. The CEO launched into his familiar routine. Grand gestures, big promises, that booming voice that made everything sound like the opportunity of a lifetime. But this time, I wasn't just listening. I was hunting. My grandfather used to say timing was everything in sales. Strike when the iron is hot, but make sure you're holding the right hammer. The CEO had just finished explaining how this deal would triple our quarterly profits within 6 months. Triple. That word hung in the air like smoke from a cheap cigar. I raised my hand. The room went quiet. Not the comfortable kind of quiet you get during a thoughtful pause. This was the awkward silence that happens right before someone asks the question nobody wants to hear. "Excuse me," I said, loud enough for the person in the back row to catch every word. "You mentioned tripling our profits in 6 months. Can you break down exactly which revenue streams will generate that growth?" The CEO's smile flickered. Just for a second, but I caught it. His assistant's pen stopped moving across her notepad. She looked up at him with eyes that screamed panic. "Well," the CEO said, his voice losing some of that trademark confidence, "it's a combination of factors. Market penetration, strategic partnerships, operational efficiency improvements, buzzwords, corporate speak. The kind of answer that sounds impressive but says absolutely nothing. My grandfather would have called it fancy wrapping on an empty box. I wasn't done. Which specific partnerships are we talking about? And what's the timeline for these efficiency improvements?" The assistant fumbled through her papers. Her hands were actually shaking. 23 pairs of eyes watched her search for answers that apparently didn't exist. The CEO cleared his throat, a nervous habit I'd noticed before but never paid attention to. "Those details are still being finalized," he said. "We're working with several potential partners." Several potential partners. Translation, we haven't secured anyone yet, but we're hoping you won't notice. Then came the moment that changed everything. Sarah from accounting, usually quiet as a church mouse, leaned forward in her chair. "Who are these potential partners?" she asked. "Are any of them actually committed to working with us?" Beautiful. One question had opened the floodgates. Now other people were getting curious, and curiosity spreads faster than gossip in a small office. The CEO's face went through more color changes than a traffic light, red to pale to somewhere in between. His assistant had given up searching through her papers and was now staring at the table like it might provide divine intervention. "Look," the CEO said, his voice taking on a defensive edge, "these are complex negotiations. We can't reveal every detail of our strategy to competitors." Competitors? What competitors were sitting in our internal company meeting? The logic made about as much sense as selling ice to penguins. Marcus from the legal department raised his eyebrows. Even he was starting to smell something fishy, and lawyers are usually the last people to question a deal that's already moving forward. The CEO tried to regain control by switching topics, but damage was done. You could feel the shift in the room's energy. That blind trust everyone had been operating with, it cracked like ice on a frozen pond. My grandfather's method was working exactly as he'd promised. Public questions create public pressure. When someone has to defend their claims in front of a crowd, the truth has a funny way of surfacing. "We'll have more concrete details next week," the CEO announced, clearly eager to wrap up this meeting before more uncomfortable questions emerged. "Next week, the classic delay tactic every smooth-talking salesman learns on day one. Promise specifics later, hope people forget to ask again." But something told me this crowd wasn't going to forget. The seed of doubt had been planted, watered, and was already starting to sprout. As people filed out of the conference room, I caught whispered conversations that hadn't been happening before, numbers being questioned, promises being examined under a microscope. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait and see what would crawl out of it. The moment I asked that direct question about the missing revenue projection, something fascinating happened. The CEO's face went completely blank for about 3 seconds. Not confused blank, caught blank. His assistant, who'd been nodding along enthusiastically just moments before, suddenly looked like she'd been asked to explain quantum physics in ancient Greek. "Well, that's a very technical question," the CEO finally said, his voice just a bit too loud. "I'd need to pull those specific figures from our back-end systems." Classic deflection move. My grandfather would have spotted that dodge from a mile away. But here's where things got interesting. The manager sitting across from me, let's call him Dave, leaned forward slightly. Dave had been quiet most of the meeting, scribbling notes and generally keeping his head down. Now he was paying attention. Real attention. "Actually," Dave said slowly, "shouldn't we have those numbers already? We discussed them last week during the quarterly review." The room temperature seemed to drop about 10 degrees. Dave wasn't trying to cause trouble, he was just confused. Makes sense, right? The CEO's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Dave, you're thinking of the preliminary figures. These are the adjusted projections based on our new market analysis." More fancy words, more redirects, but something had shifted in the room's energy. Then, Sarah from accounting spoke up. "I don't remember seeing any adjusted projections cross my desk." Her voice was steady, professional, not accusatory, just factual. The kind of tone that cuts through nonsense like a hot knife through butter. And the weird part is, once one person starts asking real questions, others follow. It's like watching dominoes fall, except each domino makes the next one braver. The CEO's story started changing in real time. First, the projected revenue was confidential pending final approval. Then, it became subject to regulatory review. Within 5 minutes, it had morphed into part of a larger strategic initiative we can't fully disclose yet. Let's not forget, this was supposed to be the cornerstone of his amazing deal. The one number that made everything else make sense. Now it was suddenly classified information. Dave pulled out his laptop. Right there in the meeting, started cross-referencing the CEO's claims against the company's actual financial reports. The clicking of his keyboard was the loudest sound in the room. "These market share figures don't match what we reported to shareholders," Dave announced quietly. Not angry, just stating facts. But facts delivered in front of witnesses hit differently than facts whispered in private conversations. The CEO's confidence, that unshakable certainty he'd displayed for weeks, began cracking like old paint. His gestures became more animated, his explanations longer and more convoluted. Classic signs of someone trying to talk their way out of a corner they've painted themselves into. Sarah opened her phone and started scrolling through emails. "I'm looking for the board authorization you mentioned for this deal structure," she said without looking up, "because I don't see any documentation in our formal channels." That's when the assistant made her fatal mistake. "Oh, that authorization went through different channels," she blurted out. "More discreet ones." Dead silence. Different channels? Discreet ones? In a publicly traded company, discrete channels for major financial decisions aren't just irregular. They're usually illegal. Everyone in that room knew it. The CEO knew. We all knew it. His face went through about 6 different expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, anger, calculation, panic, resignation, and finally, defeat. The kind of look you see when someone realizes their elaborate house of cards is collapsing in real time. But why was this happening so fast? Simple. Once people start comparing notes out loud, lies lose their power instantly. Deception works best in isolation, when everyone's doubting themselves instead of questioning the source. The meeting essentially ended right there, though we sat in awkward silence for another few minutes. The CEO mumbled something about regrouping with updated materials and scheduling a follow-up session. Translation, he needed time to figure out damage control. As people filed out, Dave caught my eye and nodded. Sarah gave me a small smile. They weren't thanking me for exposing a lie. They were thanking me for giving them permission to trust their instincts. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is ask the obvious question everyone's thinking, but nobody wants to voice. The CEO's carefully constructed narrative had unraveled in less than 20 minutes. Not because I'd prepared some brilliant argument or hired forensic accountants, just because I'd asked one simple, direct question in front of the right people at the right moment. My grandfather's old wisdom was proving itself again. Confidence can indeed be faked, but facts, especially facts examined under public scrutiny, cannot. The truth has a way of standing tall when you stop letting people hide it in shadows. What happened next would prove just how powerful that simple principle really is. Walking out of that meeting, I felt like I just watched a magician's trick fall apart in slow motion. The CEO's carefully constructed story crumbled the moment I asked one simple question in front of everyone. But here's what really hit me. My grandfather's Depression-era sales wisdom had just taken down a modern corporate con artist. Think about that for a second. A technique from the 1930s, when people sold suits door to door and handshake deals mattered, had exposed a lie wrapped in PowerPoint presentations and quarterly projections. Makes you wonder what else we've forgotten, right? The beauty of those old school methods isn't their complexity. It's their brutal simplicity. When that CEO couldn't explain the missing numbers, he didn't have time to craft another elaborate story. Public pressure strips away the fancy packaging and forces people to deal with raw facts. No spreadsheets to hide behind. No, let me circle back on that nonsense. Just truth or lies right there in the open. Well, it turns out most modern leaders have never faced this kind of direct challenge. They're used to boardrooms where everyone nods politely and asks softball questions. They expect people to accept complexity as competence. But when someone stands up and says, "Wait, explain that part again, the numbers don't add up," suddenly all that smooth confidence starts looking pretty shaky. Let's not forget how powerful scarcity and urgency still are as manipulation tools. The CEO kept pushing that limited time angle, making everyone feel like they'd miss out if they ask too many questions. Classic pressure tactic. But here's the kicker. These tricks only work when people stay quiet. The moment someone speaks up publicly, the spell breaks. And the weird part is how fast trust can evaporate once doubt creeps in. That manager who started checking the numbers for himself, he wasn't the suspicious type. But watching the CEO squirm under one simple question made him realize he should probably verify things himself. Doubt is contagious when it's based on facts. My grandfather used to say something that stuck with me. A liar needs privacy to work. Put them in the sunshine and watch them wilt. He was talking about suit salesmen who'd promise one thing in private and deliver another. But the principle applies everywhere. Secret deals, rush contracts, pressure to decide without consulting others. These are all ways to keep lies in the shadows. Then there's the power of one confident voice. Before I asked that question, everyone in the room was going along with the program. Not because they were stupid, but because nobody else was speaking up. Social proof works both ways. When people see others accepting something, they assume it must be okay. But when one person challenges it publicly, others suddenly feel permission to think for themselves. Here's what really gets me. We've made business so complicated that simple questions feel revolutionary. How much will this actually cost us? Becomes a radical act. Can you explain this in plain English? Sounds like an attack. But complexity is often just confusion wearing a fancy suit. The CEO's reaction told me everything I needed to know. Honest people welcome questions because they help clarify genuine misunderstandings. Liars hate questions because each one is a potential trap. When someone gets defensive about explaining their own proposal, that's your first red flag right there. But why do these old techniques work so well against modern deception? Because human nature hasn't changed. People still feel pressure. They still want to appear smart by going along with complex-sounding proposals. They still worry about being the only one to speak up. The packaging has evolved, but the psychology remains the same. What my grandfather understood, and what that CEO learned the hard way, is that facts spoken out loud have a different power than facts buried in documents. When you ask someone to explain something publicly, you're not just seeking information, you're creating accountability. Everyone becomes a witness to their answer. The truth doesn't need perfect lighting or ideal circumstances to shine. It just needs someone willing to ask the right question at the right moment. That's what happened in that boardroom. One question, asked publicly, created enough light to expose what was really going on. My grandfather was right about honesty standing tallest in daylight, but he also taught me something else that day's events made crystal clear. Sometimes you have to be the one to turn on the lights. Most people are waiting for someone else to ask the tough questions. They're hoping somebody braver will speak up first. Well, here's what I discovered about being that someone and what happened when other people started asking their own questions. Walking away from that boardroom, I felt like I just watched a magician's trick fall apart in slow motion. The CEO, who seemed so untouchable 20 minutes earlier, now looked like any other person caught in a lie. His fancy suit couldn't hide the sweat on his forehead. His confident voice had turned into nervous mumbling. But here's what really hit me. This whole thing happened because I asked one simple question out loud. That's it, one question. My grandfather would have loved this moment. He spent decades watching people try to sell things that weren't quite what they seemed. Back in the 1930s, he learned that most lies crumble the second someone speaks up. Not because the lies are complicated, but because they're usually built on nothing. The trick isn't being the smartest person in the room, it's being the one person willing to sound dumb by asking obvious questions. When something sounds too good to be true, most people stay quiet. They worry about looking foolish. They assume someone else must understand what's happening. Well, here's a secret. Nobody else understands either. They're all just nodding along, hoping they don't get caught looking confused. Let's not forget what actually stopped this CEO. It wasn't a fancy investigation or months of research. It was me asking about one missing number while everyone was listening. That's the power of daylight on a shady deal. The funniest part? After everything fell apart, 3 different people came up to me. Each one said the same thing. I was thinking the exact same question, but I didn't want to interrupt. They all had doubts. They all noticed something felt wrong, but nobody wanted to be the first person to speak up. Makes sense, right? We're taught to be polite. We're told not to question authority figures. We learn to wait our turn and follow the rules, but sometimes the rules are exactly what dishonest people count on. And the weird part is how fast everything changed once the truth came out. The same people who were nodding enthusiastically 10 minutes earlier suddenly became experts at spotting red flags. They started pointing out problems they'd noticed all along. Amazing how clear everyone's vision gets after someone else takes the risk of speaking first. Then there's the lesson about old tricks still working. That CEO was using the same pressure tactics my grandfather saw in the 1930s. Create urgency, make it seem exclusive. Don't give people time to think. Rush them into decisions before they can ask questions. These tricks work because human nature hasn't changed much in 90 years. We still want to believe in easy solutions. We still get excited about special deals. We still feel pressure when someone important is watching, but why do we keep falling for the same old games? Because most people don't know what to look for. They don't realize that confidence can be performed. They don't understand that fancy presentations can hide simple lies. The truth is, most scams aren't that creative. They're just old ideas dressed up in new clothes. The CEO's revolutionary business opportunity was basically the same thing my grandfather's customers heard about exclusive fabric deals in 1932. Different words, same game. Here's what I wish someone had told me years ago. Your gut feeling is usually right, but it's not enough by itself. You need to test that feeling with facts. Ask direct questions. Demand clear answers. Don't let anyone rush you into decisions that affect your money or your future. Most importantly, remember that asking questions isn't rude. It's smart. The people who get upset when you ask for details are usually the ones with something to hide. Honest people welcome questions because they know their answers will make sense. Every time I think about that boardroom moment, I smile. Not because I embarrassed someone, but because I finally understood what my grandfather meant about truth, standing tallest in daylight. Lies need shadows to survive. They need confusion and rushed decisions and people who stay quiet. But the moment someone turns on the lights and asks simple questions, most lies just disappear. The strangest thing happened the next week, though. Word spread about what went down in that meeting. Suddenly, people started asking me about other deals, other opportunities, other situations that felt a little off. They wanted to know how to spot the next lie before it got them in trouble. Turns out, learning to question one dishonest person gives you the tools to question them all. And once you start seeing these patterns, you can't unsee them. The world becomes a much more interesting place when you realize how many people are running variations of the same old tricks.